difficult is it to replace my McPherson struts?
It's not really very difficult. It comes off much the same way as a regular shock absorber, in that you have an upper mount that has to be removed and a lower mount. After the strut's off the car, then you have to compress the spring and remove that. This is the way the strut looks without a spring on it.
Mm-hmm. So this is a new replacement unit here.
Right.
Do you have an example?
Yeah, let's take a look.
Okay.
The items you'll need to replace your McPherson struts include the correct size wrenches for the lower mounting bolts, a 1/2-inch drive socket set, a hammer and punch, a torque wrench, a jack and a set of jack stands, and some penetrating oil. The specialty tool needed is a strut spring compressor, which is usually available for rent or sale where you purchase your struts. The items you'll need are the replacement strut assemblies and a new strut cushion and boot. The first step is to familiarize yourself with the instructions prior to beginning your removal. Then park the vehicle on a level surface and raise the end you'll be working on. Set the parking brake and block the tires on the opposite end from where you'll be working. Place jack stands under the frame of the vehicle and allow the weight of the vehicle to rest on the stands. Spray any mounting hardware with penetrating oil to help loosen rusty or stubborn bolts. In our example, we first remove the brake line bracket attached to the strut and move the brake line off to the side out of the way. With the correct size wrenches, loosen and remove the lower strut mounting bolts. With the nut near the end of the mounting bolts, give them a solid rap with a hammer to loosen the bolts in the mounting. Remove the nuts and drive the lower mounting bolts the rest of the way out with a hammer and punch. Now hold the strut in place and pull on the rotor and lower mount to separate the strut from the lower mount. Next, move up to the top side of the strut mount. There is a large nut in the center, which is the piston rod nut. Do not remove this nut at this time. Now remove the upper housing nuts with the ratchet and socket. Before removing the last upper housing nut, place a shop towel over the CV boot, which is located directly below the strut assembly. This will help protect the CV boot from damage during strut removal. While holding the strut assembly from the lower side, finish removing the last upper mounting nut and remove the entire strut assembly from the vehicle. Now move over to the workbench and mount the strut securely in a bench vise. Although not necessary, it will definitely make the disassembly procedures go easier. Then lubricate the threads of the spring compressor before installing it on the spring. Position the compressors on the strut spring so you'll be compressing as many spring coils as possible. Locate them 180 degrees apart from each other and begin tightening them with the ratchet wrench. Compression of the coil spring is necessary to remove the spring and upper mount from the old strut. The spring compressor is tight enough when you can freely move the spring on the spring mount. Now, loosen and remove the upper piston rod nut and remove the upper support housing from the strut. Lift the spring and upper spring seat, compressor attached, off from the strut and set it aside. Remove and discard the old strut and secure the new strut in the bench vise. Only secure the new strut on its mounting flange to prevent damaging the cylinder body. In our application, we had to install a spring guard on the spring seat as shown. Next, install the new striker plate over the piston rod. Slide the new strut compression bumper on the piston rod with the correct side up. And position the new strut boot in place. Work the boot down over the lower strut body and also up and over the strut compression bumper. Lastly, secure the new dust boot in place with the wire tie supplied. Now position the coil spring and spring compressor in place on the new strut body. Twist the spring until the lower coil is in place with the indent in the lower spring seat. Before reinstalling the upper spring seat, you must remove the old dust boot and strut bumper cushion as demonstrated. Install the upper spring seat and twist it into place until the stop is in alignment with the upper end of the coil spring. Now, reinstall the upper support housing. Install the new washer and begin threading the new piston rod nut on by hand and then continue by snugging it in place with the ratchet and socket. Using a screwdriver to hold the upper support housing in place, we completed our final tightening of the piston rod nut with a torque wrench. Torque this nut to the factory recommended torque specification. Now carefully loosen the spring compressors with the ratchet by alternately loosening each side equally until you can remove the spring compressors from the spring. Lastly, before reinstalling the new strut assembly on the car, align the tongue in the upper housing with the lower mounting flange as shown. Position the new strut assembly on the vehicle and start the upper mounting nuts on by hand. With the upper mounting bolts all started by hand, begin by snugging them in place with the ratchet wrench. Complete final tightening of the upper mounting bolts by torquing them to factory specifications with a torque wrench. Hold the lower end of the strut in place and align the lower strut mount. You may need to wiggle the strut and mount around a little to ease alignment. Install the lower bolt, and then install the upper mounting bolt. Next, install the eccentric washer and nut on the lower mounting bolt. It is critical this bolt is in the same position as removed from for proper wheel alignment. Now reinstall the brake hose mounting bracket. Start the bolt in the threads by hand and tighten securely with a socket and ratchet. Snug up the lower mounting bolts and complete final tightening with a torque wrench to the correct factory specifications, and you're done. The last step is to have the front end of your vehicle aligned by a certified alignment specialist. Correct wheel alignment is critical for proper vehicle handling and tire life.
Let's quickly review how to inspect and replace a clevis type strut. To determine if your clevis struts need replacement, inspect for leaks and damage. Before replacing the struts, read all the instructions first. Begin by raising and supporting the vehicle. Spray all mounting bolts and nuts with penetrating oil to ease removal. Remove any brake lines or attachments from the strut. Remove all lower and upper mounting bolts from the strut. Do not remove the piston nut at this time. Remove the strut from the vehicle and mount in a vise. Using a spring compressing tool, compress the coil spring on the strut. Next, remove the upper strut support housing and coil spring seat from the strut. Install the new strut in your vise and install any hardware or rubber boots. Install the coil spring and upper spring seat onto the new strut. Loosen the spring compressing tool from the coil spring. Position the strut on the vehicle and install the upper mounting bolts. Now install the lower mounting bolts and washers in the correct position. Finally, test drive the vehicle to ensure proper replacement.
The tools you will need to replace the front struts on the 87 and newer GM W10 chassis include a socket set and sockets, most likely metric, a torque wrench, and the correct spanner wrench for the installation. Spanner wrenches are usually available where you purchase your new struts. First, read and familiarize yourself with the installation instructions before starting the repair. Then park the vehicle on a level surface and open the hood. This is where the upper mount of the strut is located. Remove the retaining nuts that hold the strut mounting cover in place. Next, remove the piston rod nut. Then remove the strut mount bushing as shown. With the piston rod nut and strut mount bushing removed, position the special spanner nut tool to loosen and remove the compression bumper retainer. Give the retainer a quarter turn counterclockwise to release it, then remove it by hand. Now remove the compression bumper. This will provide access to the body nut. Again, using a special spanner wrench,